sound of a biting winter wind howling through bare trees, punctuated by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a closing book. In the winter of 1824, the town of Hadley witnessed an event that defied every logic of human survival. Within 90 days, 17 entire families, men, women, and children, simply walked away. They didn't pack. They didn't flee a crime. They abandoned their warm hearths and ancestral lands, walking into the frozen wilderness as if answering a silent, irresistible call. No signs of struggle were ever found. Only a single name remained, whispered in the shadow of the empty houses. Professor Ezekiel Drummond. What lay hidden in Drummond's private study would eventually challenge the very definition of the human mind. The science of the 1800s had no words for the systematic destruction of human will he had perfected. Before we unravel the mystery of the families who walked into oblivion, make sure to subscribe to never miss a descent into history's darkest corners. And tell us in the comments what state or city are you listening from. We want to see how far this forgotten truth reaches. Hadley, in 1824, was the pinnacle of New England's stability. Prosperous community of 800 souls, nestled in the fertile Connecticut River Valley. The town was a portrait of colonial order, where tobacco and corn grew in the rich alluvium and white-clapboard houses with black shutters lined the prestigious King Street. Spiritual life was balanced between the traditional Congregationalist meeting house led by Reverend Moses Kingsley and the newer Methodist chapel of Reverend Patrick O'Brien. It was a place where progress was measured by the harvest and the intellectual pedigree of its youth. At the center of this pride was the Hadley Academy, a grand 3-story brick institution on Elm Street. It was the gatekeeper to the Ivy League, preparing the sons of New England's elite for Harvard and Yale. To gain admission was to secure a family's future. In the autumn of 1821, the town's intellectual landscape changed forever with the arrival of Ezekiel Drummond. He came with impeccable credentials from Harvard and letters of recommendation that spoke of a revolutionary approach to education. At 30, Drummond was an imposing figure over 6 feet tall, with a lean, scholarly build and a grace that suggested absolute self-possession. His most unsettling features were his eyes, pale, gray, almost silver, with an intensity that made people feel he was looking directly into their souls. His hair was prematurely silver at the temples, giving him a mask of ancient wisdom. But it was his voice that truly captivated Hadley. He was never raised, always conversational, yet students and parents alike described it as hypnotic. There was a modulation in his tone that made the most mundane observation sound like a profound revelation. Under Drummond's leadership, the Academy's enrollment doubled. He discarded the traditional methods of rote memorization and strict discipline, introducing what he termed introspective learning. He required every student to keep a detailed journal, not for academic notes, but for documenting their deepest emotional responses, their private observations of others, and their most hidden moral dilemmas. These journals were the foundation of Drummond's power. He spent countless hours reading these private thoughts, marking the margins with unsettlingly precise notes. He then initiated private conferences with the young men. During these sessions, Drummond treated their inner lives with a seriousness no adult had ever offered them. The students found these meetings both thrilling and terrifying. It felt as though the professor understood their inner architecture better than they did themselves. By the winter of 1824, Drummond had moved beyond being a teacher. He had become the architect of their very wills. The prestige of the Hadley Academy grew so immense that wealthy families from Boston and New York began competing for a single seat in Drummond's classroom. These families, the architects of American commerce, were offering fortunes just to have their sons shaped by the man they called a visionary. Drummond, meanwhile, settled into the grand colonial house on Elm Street, a massive 12-room structure built in 1745 by Colonel Josiah Dwight. The house was a monument to the town's history, yet Drummond filled it with a disturbing solitude. He employed no servants, allowed no visitors, and lived a life governed by the absolute precision of a machine. Every morning at 5, he would be in his study, dissecting the journals of his students with the focus of a surgeon. His evening routine, however, was what truly began to haunt the town. At exactly 6 o'clock, he would emerge in a long black coat, carrying a leather-bound journal. He walked the streets, not as a resident, but as a predator of information. He would stand at garden gates for 10 minutes at a time, staring into windows, watching families dine, discipline their children, and interact in their most private moments. When Abigail Hartwell, a keen observer of the town's pulse, questioned him, he offered a chillingly plausible academic shield. He was a domestic anthropologist studying the social dynamics of rural life. His intellectual authority was so crushing that it made the townspeople feel foolish for sensing the danger that was right in front of them. Then came the great frost of 1824. The winter was not just cold, it was apocalyptic. Snow accumulated until drifts reached second-story windows, and the Connecticut River froze solid for the first time in decades. This environmental imprisonment was exactly what Drummond needed. The town was forced into a state of isolation and vulnerability, huddled around hearths, while the professors stalked the snowy perimeters. The first to be erased from existence were the Chamberlains. Samuel Chamberlain was the pillar of the community, a grain merchant whose warehouses were the lifeblood of the valley. His wife, Mercy, was the towness moral compass leading charitable societies with a quiet intelligence. They had 3 children. Benjamin, a promising scholar at the academy. Sarah, a gifted musician. And little Thomas, whose laughter was a fixture in Hadley's streets. On the night of January 14th, the Chamberlains were the picture of normalcy. Samuel was planning a business trip to Springfield. Mercy was organizing a community social to break the winter's gloom, and the children were excited about the snow. There was no conflict, no debts, and no reason to leave. Yet, on the morning of January 15th, Abigail Hartwell noticed a terrifying sight. In debiter bon chilling cold, there was no smoke rising from the Chamberlain chimney. For a household as disciplined as Samuel's, the cold hearth was an omen of something unthinkable. The silence of the house was absolute, a void in the heart of Pleasant Street that the town was not yet ready to investigate. Mrs. Hartwell, gripped by a neighbor's intuition, wrapped herself in her cloak and crossed the yard. The snow was a pristine, terrifying canvas, marked only by a single set of tracks leading from the Chamberlain door toward the eastern woods. To air, horror. The prints were made by bare feet, an anatomical impossibility in a sub-zero New England winter, where skin would freeze to bone within minutes. The front door stood ajar, an invitation to a house that had become a tomb of silence. Inside, the air was unnaturally cold, as if the very concept of warmth had been sucked out of the wooden walls. In the kitchen, Mrs. Hartwell found a scene of ritualistic precision. The table was set with the family, the finest china, usually reserved for the highest guests, with congealed porridge and tea frozen into amber ice. But there was a fifth-place setting at the head of the table, an honored guest who was never seen but clearly expected. In the parlor, the interruption of life was even more jarring. School books lay opened with quills dropped mid. Benjamin's Latin exercise was half finished, the ink still wet enough to smear. Little Thomas's toys were arranged in a pattern of a game that hadn't been finished, but rather paused in an instant. Most hauntingly, the family's heavy winter coats, fur-lined gloves, and sturdy boots still hung on their pegs. The Chamberlains had walked into a lethal January frost in nothing but their indoor clothes. Or perhaps nothing at all. Constable Thomas Brewster arrived to find the house untouched by struggle or theft. Samuel's strongbox was full of silver, and Mercy's pearls sat undisturbed. Even the livestock had been meticulously tended to that very morning. The cow milked and the chickens fed by someone who moved with the calm of a ghost. The tracks outside told a story of mechanical, single-minded purpose. 4 sets of footprints, 2 adult and 2 child-sized, moved in a perfectly straight line across the 2-foot-deep snow. There were no signs of stumbling, no hesitation, no frantic running from a threat. It was the walk of a search party of every able-bodied man in Hadley followed these tracks for half a mile until they reached the edge of the old-growth forest. There, the footprints didn't fade or get covered by wind. They simply ended abruptly. It was as if the Chamberlains had reached the perimeter of reality and stepped into another dimension. For 3 days, the woods were searched, but not a scrap of cloth or a drop of blood was found. Suspicions soon began to coil around Professor Drummond. Witnesses recalled a conversation between Drummond and Samuel Chamberlain days prior, where the professor spoke in low, hypnotic tones about the burden of hidden shame and the peace of abandoning false identities. More disturbing was the testimony of Marcus Head, who revealed that Drummond had assigned his students to write character studies of their own families, specifically focusing on their parents' private moral failures. Benjamin Chamberlain had been obsessed with this, unearthing secrets about his father's business dealings that supposedly troubled the man's prayers. When Brewster demanded to see the essay, Drummond, clinical and cold, refused. He cited pedagogical confidentiality, hiding behind his academic prestige while the boy who wrote the words had vanished into the frozen dark. The vacuum left by the Chamberlains didn't remain empty for long. It was quickly filled with a paralyzing, suffocating fear. Brewster's inability to seize Benjamin's essay, one that supposedly held the secrets of Samuel's troubled prayers, left the town in a state of legal and emotional limbo. As January turned to February, the community of Hadley fractured along the lines of its own beliefs. Rationalists argued that bandits must have coerced the family into the woods for hidden grain profits, while others blamed seasonal madness brought on by the most brutal winter in decades. In the pulpits, the divide grew deeper. Reverend Kingsley suggested divine wrath for spiritual backsliding, noting the family had missed 2 services. Meanwhile, the Catholic immigrants, led by Reverend O'Brien, whispered of ancient, hungry curses in the soil itself, drawing on Irish folklore about the earth swallowing the living. Even the oldest superstitions resurfaced. Stories of indigenous spirits guarding sacred ground claimed to have taken the Chamberlains as penance for colonial settlement. Through this chaos, Professor Ezekiel Drummond moved with a mechanical precision that felt increasingly predatory. His evening walks expanded into territories he had previously ignored, his silver-gray eyes lingering on the windows of every prominent home. Inside the academy, the psychological siege intensified. Drummond's new assignments were no longer about literature. They were clinical dissections of the students' own flesh and blood. He demanded they identify the fragility in their parents, the shame in their siblings, and the unresolved guilt that kept their households awake at night. He rewarded the most intrusive observations with a terrifyingly intimate praise, turning sons into spies within their own homes. Marcus Edric, the intelligent and sensitive son of the town's physician, became the primary vessel for this manipulation. Under Drummond's tutelage, Marcus began to view his father, Dr. Jeremiah Hedrick, not as idle but as a man collapsing under a secret melancholy. He watched his mother, Elizabeth, obsessively check the locks, documenting it as a symptom of psychological instability rather than a rational response to a disappearance. He even began to analyze the nightmares of his 12-year-old sister, Sarah, looking for a trauma to report back to his master. Dr. Jeremiah Hedrick was the only man capable of challenging Drummond intellectually. Initially, the Yale-educated doctor had welcomed the professor as a peer, hungry for sophisticated discourse in a town obsessed with crops and gossip. Their early meetings were a sanctuary of ideas discussing European philosophy and the emerging link between the physical body and the mental state. However, as the hearth fires burned low in midwinter, the doctor noticed a sickening shift. Drummond began to obsess over the breaking point of human endurance and the methods of absolute psychological control. Most chilling was Drummond's unexplained access to information. During their private talks, the professor would offhandedly mention intimate medical details from the doctor, his own private consultations, and domestic disputes that should have been locked behind closed doors. It was as if Drummond hadn't just been reading the students' journals, but had found a way to read the very walls of Hadley itself. Dr. Hedrick, sensing the rot at the heart of his own home, finally confronted Drummond. The professor merely smiled, speaking vaguely of his talent for reading signs, and suggesting that most human beings were transparent to anyone with sufficient knowledge of the mind. But this academic arrogance was a mask for a much darker transformation taking place in Hedrick's son, Marcus. The boy, once the light of their home, had become a ghost secretive, calculating, and cold. He began studying his parents and his 12-year-old sister, Sarah, as if they were specimens under a microscope. He asked invasive questions about debts, old fears, and private shames, documenting their psychological pressure points with a clinical detachment that chilled his father's blood. The breaking point came when Dr. Hedrick discovered Marcus's anthropological journal. Inside, the boy had dissected his own family's souls for his weekly assignments. He described his mother's anxiety patterns and his father's professional insecurities with the precision of a predator studying prey. Most horrifying was the analysis of little Sarah. The boy had calculated how to manipulate her through her protective instincts, noting her potential for a psychological breakdown. If pressured, Dr. Hedrick realized with a jolt of terror that the academy was no longer a school, it was a military-grade intelligence operation. Drummond had turned the town's most promising sons into unwitting spies, gathering a massive archive of every family dispute and secret vulnerability in Hadley. As February deepened, the doctor discovered that Drummond's reach extended beyond the students. He had cultivated relationships with shopkeepers, servants, and laborers, systematically mapping the psychological landscape of the entire community. There were no laws in 1824 for this kind of psychological warfare. Drummond wasn't just a teacher. He was an architect of the human will, experimenting with how to convince people to abandon their lives voluntarily. The haunting question wasn't if he had the power to do it, but if anyone would believe such a thing was possible in an era when the science of the mind was still in its infancy. The nightmare struck again on February 23rd. Exactly 39 days after the Chamberlains vanished. This time, it was the Prescott family William, the town's master blacksmith, his wife Hannah, and their 14-year-old twin daughters. Like the first disappearance, they left no explanation and took no possessions. In the brutal, bone-snapping cold of a New England winter, the Prescotts walked out of their warm beds and into the wilderness wearing nothing but their thin nightclothes, leaving behind a cold forge in a town that was slowly beginning to realize it was being devoured from within. William Prescott was a man of iron, both by trade and temperament, standing 6 feet tall and built from 2 decades of striking the anvil. He was the literal and metaphorical anchor of Hadley. As a deacon of the Congregationalist Church, his deep voice led the hymns that gave the town its spiritual rhythm. His wife, Hannah, was no less vital. As a midwife and herbalist, she had ushered 60 lives into the world and saved countless more with her knowledge of medicinal plants. Their twin daughters, Martha and Mary, were tetones, finest seamstress. When this famille, the very definition of strength and faith, vanished, the last remnants of Hadley's security shattered. The pattern was a chilling echo of the Chamberlains: a cold hearth, a half-prepared breakfast, and those impossible bare footprints leading into the freezing dark of the forest. However, this time, a witness emerged. Reverend Moses Kingsley had watched from a distance as Hannah Prescott stood in an hour-long trance-like conversation with Drummond. He described her transformation as profoundly spiritual, as if she had been granted a revelation that made her earthly life irrelevant. Simultaneously, Dr. Hedrick discovered that Drummond had been visiting William at his forge under the guise of academic commissions. There, amidst the heat and smoke, Drummond had whispered to the blacksmith about the burden of hidden shame and the necessity of ultimate redemption. These were not mere chats. They were psychological crowbars, prying open the deepest cracks in the man's soul. Dr. Hedrick's investigation soon revealed the terrifying machinery behind these disappearances. Drummond had constructed a surveillance network that would have rivaled a national intelligence agency. He didn't just use his students. He had recruited the people Hadley overlooked. Mrs. Prudence Wakefield, an elderly domestic worker, confessed that Drummond made her feel like a learned woman, valuing her observations of the family she served as vital scientific data. He had recruited Tom Patterson, the stable boy, to report on the hushed arguments of couples, Sarah Mills, the seamstress, to report on the financial decay hidden in mended clothes, and even the postmaster, Jonathan Hayes, who shared the patterns of private correspondence. Drummond was a master of the ego trap. He paid these informants enough to make them dependent, but not enough to draw suspicion. More importantly, he gave them a sense of intellectual importance they had never known. By cross-referencing these sources, Drummond built comprehensive psychological dossiers on every prominent family. He knew their debts, their illicit affairs, and their ancestral shames. He wasn't just observing Hadley. He was mapping its pressure points, waiting for the perfect moment to apply his deadly influence. The third tragedy struck on March 11th. The Cornelius family, a wealthy merchant, his wife Ruth, and their son, Timothy, dissolved into the wilderness. Jonathan had spent his final 2 weeks in an agitated state, haunted by a secret Drummond had unearthed from 40 years prior. His father's desertion from the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. In the honor-bound society of 1824, This was a stain that could destroy a lineage. Drummond had slowly convinced Jonathan that this secret was no longer safe, that the inherited shame was beginning to leak into the town's consciousness, like a predator leading a wounded animal. Drummond had convinced a prosperous man that his only escape from the false identity of a gentleman was to walk into the oblivion of the forest. The psychological assault on the Cornelius family revealed the terrifying precision of Drummond's guilt. He didn't just threaten Jonathan. He manufactured a world where Jonathan felt the truth was surfacing on its own. Staged conversations at the general store about deserters and books on military honor accidentally left in plain sight. It was a systematic erosion of the man's sanity. However, the most devastating blow fell upon Dr. Hedrick himself. He discovered that his son, Marcus, had been promoted from a mere informant to a junior manipulator. Marcus had been trained in social influence techniques, learning to weaponize human psychology under the guise of academic research. In a midnight confrontation, the boy revealed a truth Dr. Hedrick had hidden from the world for a decade. His private addiction to laudanum, an opium-based medicine used to manage chronic headaches. Marcus didn't speak with anger or betrayal, but with a clinical, frozen detachment. He had read his father like a medical textbook, observing the morning tremors of his hands and his defensive reactions to medication questions. This transformation was fueled by Drummond's psychological atlas, a secret, advanced manual that documented the precise methods to bypass any human's mental defenses. This atlas contained case studies from other towns, proving Drummond's horrific thesis that human conviction is infinitely malleable and anyone can be convinced to abandon their life if the right pressure is applied. Drummond wasn't just a scholar. He was a manufacturer of ruin. He orchestrated gambling debts and social scandals to force his subjects into moral compromises, making them even more vulnerable to his redemption. The Chamberlains and Prescotts weren't just neighbors who left. They would test subjects for different psychological profiles. Most chillingly, Marcus's latest report dissected his 12-year-old sister, Sarah, analyzing her protective instincts as a potential path to a total psychological breakdown. When Dr. Hedrick screamed in rage at the destruction of their family bond, Marcus's response was the ultimate proof of his conditioning. He claimed family loyalty was merely an obstacle to objective scientific analysis. The boy's soul had been successfully replaced by Drummond's cold, predatory logic. The transformation of Marcus was a masterpiece of cold, clinical cruelty. Drummond had successfully severed the boy's natural ties to his family, replacing love with an analytical obsession that treated his own parents as lab specimens. On the night of March 15th, 1824, Dr. Hedrick, armed with a loaded pistol and the devastating intelligence reports his son had compiled, went to confront the professor. He found Drummond in his study, a room that now felt less like a scholar's sanctuary and more like a predator's lair. Drummond didn't flinch at the confrontation. Instead, he welcomed it with a terrifying, bloodless smile. He spoke of his actions not as crimes, but as the greatest gift possible, the liberation of the Chamberlains and the Prescotts from the prison of social pretense. When Hedrick shouted murder, Drummond laughed, pointing out that in the eyes of the law, he had broken no rules. There were no corpses, only people who had voluntarily chosen to walk away. What followed was a revelation that expanded the horror far beyond the borders of Hadley. Drummond revealed that he was not an isolated madman, but part of a secret, elite network of pioneers scattered across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. They were sharing encrypted findings and refining techniques to map the malleability of the human conviction. To Drummond, the families of Hadley were mere data points in a larger experiment, to prove that any person could be convinced to dissolve their own identity if the right psychological pressure was applied. He showed Hedrick portions of his correspondence letters that detailed how to identify pressure points and weaponize shame. The professor had systematized the manipulation that charlatans had used for centuries, turning it into a silent, invisible science of warfare. Realizing that no court in 1824 had the language or the laws to punish a man for psychological conditioning, Dr. Hedrick abandoned the law for a more primal justice. He leveled his pistol and gave Drummond 24 hours to vanish from Hadley forever. To Hedrick's surprise, Drummond agreed not out of fear, but out of a sickening sense of completion. "This community has served its purpose," he remarked with clinical satisfaction. He had gathered enough data. On March 17th, Drummond disappeared, taking his journals and his atlas of human vulnerability with him, leaving no address and no explanation. The Hadley Academy collapsed within a month, and the 17 families were never seen again. Whether they died in the frozen forest or survived to start new, shame-filled lives under his shadow remained, a mystery that haunted the town for generations. Dr. Hedrick spent his remaining years until his death in 1867, obsessively researching Drummond's methods. His private papers, later donated to Harvard, would serve as some of the earliest, most disturbing documentation of psychological manipulation, a field that wouldn't be formally recognized for another century. The story of Hadley serves as a dark reminder that the most dangerous weapons are always made of iron or lead. Sometimes, they are made of carefully chosen words, spoken at precisely the right moments to minds conditioned for maximum vulnerability. The real tragedy wasn't just that these families were lost, but that they were convinced to lose themselves. If you found this tale as chilling as I did, and if you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy. Hit the notification bell and share this video with someone who appreciates the darker corners of American history.